Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for yet another episode of How We Build This Toronto, a webinar series featuring the leaders of the real estate industry and the story behind the movement they built. I'm Nama Blonder. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. My co-host and dear friend is Lirad Kligman, the co-founder of the Yorkville team, a residential and commercial sales team in Toronto. We started this webinar series back in June. I wonder how many we had. Okay, next time I promise I'll tell you what the current number is, but we started in this webinar series in order to have a casual conversation with the leaders in the industry and ask them the questions we never had the chance to ask. And it's not so much about the real estate industry or how it is going to be post-COVID. We have enough of those discussions. It's really about their core values in the company and the story and how they take an idea and translate it into action. I'm very excited about today's episode, Lirad.
Yes, as am I, very excited. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mazyar Mortazavi. He's president and CEO of TAS. Over the past 20 years, Mazyar has led the evolution of TAS from a custom home builder to a mixed-use developer that engages, designs, and invests with intent to build more inclusive, livable cities. A dedicated and determined city builder, Mazyar guides a growing team of passionate experts who push the boundaries, experiment, and innovate to solve pressing urban needs. Mazyar's playbook is simple: live out your passion in everything you do. I love that. His commitment to leverage capital to drive impact and enhancing profitability through community-focused engagement have positioned TAS as a leader in values-focused corporate culture and leadership. Mazyar, thank you so much for joining us today. And why don't you just start off by telling us a bit about who you are and how you got into this business?
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. Trained as an architect, did my undergrad, my master's degrees at University of Waterloo here just outside of Toronto. Got involved with the business. Gosh, my friends went to summer camp. I went to construction site, so I don't know, but from a kid really, and sort of have been in this. It is a family business, and so got involved with it from the very early days when the business was actually out of the family basement. So, in a boardroom by day. Sort of homework table by night, and it became sort of a growing passion over the years. That's sort of the snippet of it. But why don't I let you sort of ask me specifically if there's an area where you want me to start right from the very beginning, and or where we'd like to go. Lirad, you want me?
There we go. Yep. So I think it's interesting that you come from a family of immigrants to Toronto. It was started by your father, and just wondering what that experience was like as a newcomer to Canada, starting up a new business, and how you went from there to chronologically to where TAS is today.
Sure. So really important correction, started by my father and mother. And the rock of the family is my mom. So family moved here from Iran in 1981. I actually literally remember we left Iran on the day after the Mehrabad airport was bombed, and we left by bus to Turkey, and sort of some vivid memories of that bus ride. Moved to Rome. We lived in Rome for about 6 months until we got our papers sorted, and then came to Canada. And we came to Canada. My parents were both architects as well. Dad had actually done a master's degree in architecture in Tehran, subsequently did a degree at the Beaux-Arts, but couldn't find a job when he came to Canada. And so he went to U of T and got a third degree and started working. He worked and worked sort of by day, or sort of studied by day, worked at night. We rarely saw him as kids growing up. And a few years in working in architecture practice, he realized it wasn't something he wanted to do. He and Mom started the business as a spec home building business in the mid 80s, and it was literally one house at a time. They sort of begged and borrowed for some money, bought their first house, tore it down, built it. The economy crashed, couldn't sell it. We moved into a house they couldn't afford. Dad took a job as an architect designing a theme park in Houston, Texas. So he'd fly out sort of Monday morning, fly back sort of Thursday night. he got a call from mom sort of saying someone gave us an offer. He said sell. He didn't ask how much. He just said sell it. You know, they made a bit of money. They bought another one. They bought two. They bought four. They bought six. And so the business grew. The 80s was about spec home building. They garnered a bit of a reputation in terms of the quality of caliber of the work that they were doing, given that they were architects. And by the 90s, they were doing custom home building. And predominantly, sort of by the mid 90s, we're building pretty much every house in the bridle path. So it went from sort of a modest 2,000 square foot infill homes to what became sort of 30, 40, 50,000 square foot sort of estate mansions in the bridle path. As I mentioned, we sort of, the family was tight. We didn't have a huge family here. Over the years, sort of aunts and uncles sort of trickled in. So growing up, everything was really with the nucleus of our family. We were pretty engaged, pretty involved with everything that happened. As I mentioned, the family business was out of the basement of the house. And so, it was, you just lived and saw every bit of it. That was just inherent. I started working construction sites as a kid. The bonus was at the end of the summer. The paycheck was a trip to London to go see my aunt and my cousins in London. And that sort of began to sort of develop a passion. Now, interestingly enough, I started painting when I was in high school, and I was sort of set on sort of pursuing a fine arts career. One funny conversation, my mom pulled me aside one day. She's like, I have an idea for you. I know you love creativity, but why don't you go become a plastic surgeon? You can be creative, and it's a medical profession, so you'll be secure long term. That lasted a whole 4 seconds, and I ultimately, went to Waterloo, did my undergrad degree in architecture at Waterloo, and then sort of was adamant that I wanted to start working. And it was really my dad's push. He said, listen, this is your last chance to go to, do a degree where you can do it on whatever you're passionate about, and just sort of put your energy in that. And so my master's thesis was sort of focused on how to preserve cultural character under the force of gentrification. And it really started around my passion around the bazaars in Isfahan, and looking at sort of what those structures look like, because, a market that's, hundreds of years old, who's been able to maintain its functional role, but evolved over time. And the parallel then for me was to look at Kensington Market, and how has Kensington Market evolved? And Kensington is really the story of Canadian sort of multiculturalism in so many different ways, as sort of a gateway to this country. And so I took sort of a lot of the lessons and learnings from that. The translation, or the bridge, was the medieval city in Europe, and then that was connected into sort of ideas around fractal theory, and looking at sort of fractal models, and how fractal models actually begin to sort of determine sort of a needs-based growth, and so looking at sort of the deep structural foundations through fractal theory, and then evolving those into sort of a city building model, which became sort of the foundation of the thesis, and predicated on this idea that if you can actually have deep-rooted sort of stability, arts and culture can then thrive on the back of that, and that arts and culture become sort of a mediator in socioeconomic differences. And I feel extraordinarily lucky. Today, our business is pretty much sort of, I was able to build out my master's thesis, and we sort of have built out the business today on that basis. The business today is sort of 4 core areas. We do ground up development, or we buy, entitle, market, sell, build mixed-use projects. We own a portfolio of retail and commercial buildings. We're building out a significant rental portfolio, and we run a private equity fund. The business is run as a social enterprise in many facets. Our vision and mission for the company is very clearly described in the way that we are sort of, our focus is around sort of driving urban resilience and bridging social inequity. It's not altruistic, we're very profitable. And to me, this is sort of the future model of the way that sort of corporate citizenship works, in that you're taking the ability through sort of corporate structures, creating sort of shareholder value, but compounding and doubling down on social returns and social capital.
So one of the questions I had in mind when you were talking and explaining how you started was, what made the shift between, custom homes, which is not what TAS is doing, into that urban lens? And if you could take us back to those days. I don't know if it really started when you graduated, because we also know that it is extremely difficult. As a recent, graduate, but take us to those first days when you established the business. What point did you say, okay, I'm onto something here, this is going to work? Because it sounds like it was still pretty revolutionary in that sense, especially coming from the custom home background.
So I don't think there was a moment. It was a series of iterations over time. My parents always sort of said their biggest concern was that I would always give everything away, everything I had away to other people. That was just my nature as a kid. And so as I looked at the work that they were doing, my parents were building these extraordinary homes for these gazillionaires who often didn't even live in Toronto. And to me, it just didn't make any sense. It's like, well, why are we spending all this, we're putting all this effort and energy into creating these beautiful things effectively as museums that are accessible by sort of, a handful of people. And so to me, it was very much, how do we actually use design to democratize sort of accessibility to quality? And so that was really the sort of the inclining of it. And so that's where it started. We did our first development site at Bathurst and Niagara Street, a building called Zed. And I remember at the time, this was 2002 when we bought the site. One of my dad's close friends, who's a developer, turned around to my dad and he's like, I'm sure your son's smart, but like, he's going to bankrupt you. He's like, what are you doing buying property on Bathurst Street? It's the armpit of the city. Like, who's ever going to want to live there? Well, it worked. It's sort of, that worked out well. And on the back of that project and through the 2000s, the only thing that grew bigger and faster than the business was my ego. It just like we were knocking it out of the park. Everything we touched felt like it turned to gold. And I remember the Thursday of the long week, Easter long weekend in 2009, we got a call from the bank, and the banker was like, we want to meet this afternoon. I was like, yeah, sure, it's great. It's the long weekend. Let's go for a drink. He's like, no, why don't you come to the office and tell your dad to come too. And so we go into the office, and like, you guys are great clients. There's a lot of potential. There's huge future for you guys, but we need several tens of millions of dollars, and we need it in 2 weeks. Otherwise, we're calling all of your bank lines. And so sort of in a panic, went home, sent a note to our investors that night, 2-week cash call. By noon on Friday morning, everyone had pulled out and said, good luck, we're not interested in investing anymore. And so effectively, we went bankrupt. And so that was sort of, we had assets, but we had no cash. The banks were calling all of our lines. We had 40 people working for us. 3 weeks later, we had 5 people working for us. And the next 3 years was fundamentally going into sort of a restructuring of the entire business. And not just my business, it was the family. It was my parents, and I'd gotten married 6 months earlier. So the Prince Charming in his sports cars and sort of posh penthouse, all of a sudden was in a 2-bedroom rental building in a used car sort of scenario. But equally, that experience sort of became the foundation. I call it my MBA years, and I should call it my Herzog MBA. We ended up bringing on a partner, Sam Herzog, who sort of, unfortunately, God rest his soul, he passed away a number of years ago, but he kicked my ass 10 times over. He made a point of telling me how stupid I was in every meeting. And ultimately became a real dear friend, because he was just so candid and sort of forthright. And he's like, listen, you can have all these dreams and you can have all these you can go save the world, but if there's no money in it, you're done. Like, it's over. So anyways, it was a really, really sort of challenging time, but it became foundational for the business. It became foundational for my partnership with my wife. She's my rock. And so we managed through that sort of period to go through some really, really deep learnings. And to me, I'm just a real avid believer that, we all fail. It's a question of how you get up and what you do with those lessons learned. And that was an extraordinary period. So there wasn't the moment. It's sort of and it continues. And the
but tell us what happens next. I'm like, okay, tell us.
Listen, you take those lessons, right? And we had a few really, really big lessons that came out of that.
Yeah, but at that moment when you went from 40 employees to 5, and you had to downsize, to that 2-bedroom apartment, what at that intersection, what's next?
Looking in the toilet bowl and wanting to throw up every morning.
Okay. You see? And how
it
you
was literally no, but listen, it was literally like the first 6 months you're in shock, right? Like you're just like how like this, it's not me, this can't be my life, this is not what it was meant to be. And so you go through this sort of, you know, extraordinary sort of reset where you question anything and everything in life. You go into a very, very dark place, and it was sort of a very dark journey for those first 6 months. You know, I had you know 10 or so personal friends who are working with us in the company. So it's like you're practically losing your business, you've lost your friends. You know, anything you thought you had was just sort of, you just becomes vapor, so it's all gone. And then it's a matter of, okay, so what are we going to do? And a lot of it was, there's tomorrow, you're healthy, get up, you know, show up, keep going. And it was, a lot of it was in the little things. A lot of it was like, you know what, just sort of, you know, through that 6 months where you're like completely down and out, as you begin to come out, you're like, you know what, I'm going to put on my jeans, I'm going to put on my nice pair of shoes, I'm going to go out again, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Like you begin to find, you know, and you get relapse, right? Like one day you wake up, you're like, fuck, this sucks, like I don't want to do this again. And like then, like, you know, a little glimmer of light, and you sort of, you take another step, and you take another step, and you know, someone reaches out who you didn't expect, and they're like, hey, how's it going? Like, you know, it's just, so it's, you know, you realize that it's so much about that incrementalism. You realize it's so much about the little things, and you begin to sort of attribute value in such a different way. You know, we were, you know, pre GFC, we were going out to posh restaurants and this and that. The one thing that happened, we had a wine cellar, sold the apartment, didn't have a wine cellar, so all the wine ended up in boxes. So for the next 6 months, my wife and I drank really good wine, and pretty much had, you know, it was bread, wine, and cheese many nights for dinner. And like, you're just like, you know what, it's a good bottle of wine, like, let's enjoy it. So listen, you realize through that, in terms of, in many ways, how little you also need, right? You realize that where the values come, you realize what's important to you, and then you begin to sort of, it's about refocusing in so many different ways. And I think it's just a really special thing to be able to, you know, to be able to get crushed like that is so incredibly unbelievable. And so I just think that, you know, we see and think of failure as something being sort of adverse or negative, but I always sort of say that if you look over the course of our lives, the number of failures we have on a relative basis are so few compared to our successes. And so they become that much more precious and valuable. And I think there's something about that. No, I've maintained a meditation practice for close to 30 years. I'm a huge believer in meditation. You know, everything that sort of relates to sort of self-connecting, and it's about your personal truth. And I think that's really what those moments begin to show you, is that they really glean a light onto sort of what is your personal truth? What are the things that matter? How are you going to take these sorts of things on? And you also realize that success really comes out of an extraordinary amount of sort of personal selfishness to become extraordinarily selfless. If you can't take care of yourself, if you can't take care of your whole being, be it sort of mind, emotion, sort of body, you don't have the foundation that you need. I go back to sort of fractals. The thing that's, fractals are the underlying sort of premise of what botany is. And if you look at a tree, you know, a tree always looks organic. There is no structure to a tree, except when you look at it at its fractal sort of basis, at its molecular level. It's very structured, right? So you need that structure in place to allow for that kind of sort of, you know, creativity to sort of to come out. And through those sort of really strained experiences, you begin to identify and define for yourself what's foundational for you. And if you can get your foundations in place, the world's your oyster.
It's a really great story, and it sounds like a very humbling experience. And I'm interested to hear how your business model sort of evolved. You talk about pivoting from that sort of crisis experience. How did your business model change from there?
And to add a question, what was the first project after those 6 months, and then how the business model evolved?
Sure. So, so what ended up happening? So this was sort of spring of 2009. We had a few projects. We ended up, one of them we brought in a partner, Lifetime, who was Sam Herzog and Mel Pearl and George Frankfurt. They became really great partners. They're sort of great friends to this day. We saw that one project through. We had a couple of other properties. We ended up sort of selling those and recapitalizing and getting ourselves repositioned. 2009 to 2012 was that reset period for us, and we didn't buy anything new. We didn't take anything new on. It was just sort of, let's just hunker down and sort of reset. Towards the latter part of that sort of phase, we started looking at, okay, so what does next look like for us, and what are the lessons learned? And a few key things came out of this for us. One was the fact that, you know, what had historically been a family industry was very quickly evolving and emerging into an institutional industry. And so with that then came sort of scale. So the scale that was happening in the market was beginning to rapidly change. And with scale, it also meant that sort of equity and capital was significantly changing, and the size and scale of equity was rapidly changing. Having gone through an experience where we sort of had fair weather friends and partners, sort of the quality of capital became a really important thing too. And so what was the kind of capital? And really reassessing and resetting what is the thesis for what we want to do and what's important to us. When our business sort of was running in sort of pre-2009, we were doing development, we were doing construction management, we were doing sales, we were doing design. Like, you know, the idea was if you're vertically integrated, everything is great. Well, we had the vertical, but we didn't have the management. It was sort of one guy trying to do all of it. So really learning as to what does management look like? How do you think of scaling, and what's the foundational pieces you need to scale an organization? And the most sort of important part of it is, what is the financial foundation you need in order to be able to then scale everything? And so that was sort of the bucket of lessons learned, and sort of, you know, at a high level. And so when we set out, we ended up sort of looking at different things and ultimately landed on wanting to sort of do a limited partnership structure. And the limited partner structure would sort of achieve a few different things for us. So limited partnership structures are effectively an investment vehicle for our friends on the line who aren't familiar with them. And what they do is that they effectively allow you to gather a group of investors who sort of give you a committed amount of funds to go into a particular asset class. Much more common in traditional private equity, and something that, you know, 10 years ago was not as common in real estate, but sort of has now evolved into becoming more prevalent. One of the big learnings for us as well was that our project structures prior to this were all done on a one-off basis. So, you know, we would put in some money, we would bring some investors, one project or two, three projects at a time. But the problem with that was that if one project went off, then that anyone who was an investor in that project was going to get we're going to lose money. And so we created the sort of a pooled fund under limited partnership. We raised some money, and then we set out we ended up acquiring 5 different properties, and that was really the reset of our next phase. And the first project we bought was a building we completed at Dundas and Keele called Duke. And sort of we started small. That was really sort of intentional on our part. It was a small boutique building. And with that project, we wanted to sort of really double down on sort of the principles and the values that were most important to me. And so it was, you know, we were a team of 5 or 6 at the time. Our strength was on sort of site identification and entitlements. We knew how to do that really, really well. And to this day, I would say that's probably one of our core differentiators. And so we bought, you know, we acquired that site. We took it through rezoning. Through that process, we ended up doing really, really deep community engagement. We partnered with a few local businesses to launch the Junction Flea Market, and sort of that just began to sort of roll things out, and it really began to set out the framework for our sort of impact and ESG sort of work. As we were launching our first LP, we also went through getting B Corp accreditation, and we also became a founding member of the Social Venture Connection, which is the only sort of accrediting social impact investing platform in Canada today. And so those were really, really important for us, because we didn't want to sort of say that we were different because we were saying we were different, but we wanted accreditation to back it. To this day, we continue to be a B Corp. We've been ranked top 10% globally for our CSR platform and the work that we do. And our third fund is also, all of our funds have been registered with the SVX, and we continue to partner with them on the impact agenda and the work that we do on that fund.
And I'm wondering, how do you, so you do things quite differently. You have a different approach to running business. And I'm wondering how you get into that sort of creative mindset and how you stay innovative and ensure that you stay ahead of the trend, of the general trend.
Mazyar, I'm getting a request from the audience. If you could speak more directly to the mic, as it goes in waves.
No problem. Hopefully that's better. I think for those of you who know Simon Sinek, he has he's developed this notion of the why. And I think what is really important for us is that the innovation and the creativity for us comes from the why. We have a problem to solve. My life's mission is to build a better city for my children and for their cohort. My why is very clear. And so we are constantly looking to solve for problems. We're problem solvers. And so it's not as though we're trying to be creative or innovative for the sake of being creative or innovative. It's just that we have really significant problems. And if we don't solve them, our kids are screwed. It's a real problem. Now, I'm very fortunate. My kids will be fine. But the problem is that my kids are going to live on an island, and it's going to really suck for them to be sitting on a lonely island. And so our innovation is deeply anchored around the purpose of the work that we do. And that's non-wavering. I couldn't care less to build another condo. I couldn't care less to sign another lease, right? I'm a huge believer that real estate is the most impactful platform to drive change in the urban context. And part of it, which is really critical for us, is that this isn't about TAS doing this. We want to show a way of doing development that's actually more profitable so that we get our industry to come along for the ride, right? We're such a tiny player in the scheme of things. And so we're not going to be able to do this on our own, but we're doing this in a non-altruistic way, because to me, I go back to my earlier comment about foundations, without financial resiliency, without that financial sort of anchor, we're not going to drive the change, right? And so that innovation, that creativity is really anchored around those core values of wanting to drive change and deep impact on a long-term basis.
Can you
systematic? I guess the one thing I will sort of say, which, and I think this is what has been, with all of the issues with COVID, the one thing that's been extraordinary with COVID is that we've seen where fundamentally the systematic problems exist in our society, be it around systematic racial issues, be it around systematic sort of social equity issues, be it around systematic housing issues. You're not going to create an incision to change the system. The system is too great and too powerful for an incision to make an impact. Right. So for me to do it one project at a time is an incision. We need the system to change.
Can you choose one of TAS's projects and share with us how it all translates into brick and mortar?
Sure.
And include the challenges as well. Like if you can, I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about our project at 299 Campbell. This is at Campbell and DuPont, west of Lansdowne. This is a site that we acquired in the early days of sort of version 2.0. We bought the site. It was zoned for employment lands. We'd gone and sort of spoken to the council, the community. They were on side for a conversion to mixed use residential or mixed use. And so, designed a beautiful building with Teeple Architects, and we made application and we got turned down. And so we appealed and we got turned down again. And along the process, we had been sort of speaking with the councillor, and we were supporting sort of the local library, and they were looking to do a renovation. It's the DuPont Perth Library. It's one of the highest used libraries in the system. And we planted the seed early on and said, well, listen, why don't we build a new library? Like if you want, we can put the library at the base of our new building. And so that passed, and the counselor called one day and said, you were talking about that library. Were you serious about the library? I was like, yeah, I was totally serious about the library. She's like, okay, well, what if we were to do a 10,000 square foot library at the base of your building? I'd be like, that'd be amazing. She's like, okay. So over a series of meetings with the community, with the counselor, with the city, we ended up getting the project approved. We got it approved for 250,000 square feet or so. And we were able to do a deal where we were selling a 10,000 square foot library to the city. We made a contribution from our Section 37. We needed additional funds, so the council worked with the community, and we ended up securing additional Section 37 monies. And the building is now under construction. It'll become a purpose-built rental building. We're really pushing to sort of change what purpose-built rental looks like in the city. And to us, it becomes exemplary of what community-based development is and how you can begin to think about development to drive community assets. And that's really, I would sort of say, the biggest sort of shift and focus for us as a company is that everything we're doing is through the community development lens. The best example, Canadian best example, and I would say sort of global precedent is Fogo Island Inn, where what Zita has done at Fogo, and this idea of actually taking an asset and being able to instill it as a catalyst for economic and social resiliency within a community is so important. And in our humble opinion, that is the direction that we need to be moving in collectively, and a move away from this notion that sort of assets are strictly sort of economic vehicles to shareholders, but that the fact that we need to build a city where the assets are those of the community and the community participates in them. While the investors make a lot of money too. For all of my investor friends on the phone who are throwing up in their mouths.
One last question, as we promised our audience that these are 30 minutes webinars, but what advice would you like to give? We have a really entrepreneurial audience here, and I'm just looking at the names, so I'm familiar with most of them. What advice would you like to give?
Don't ever ask for advice. Ask for people's lessons learned.
Perfect. That's a good advice. Okay, and with that, we'll wrap up. Mazyar, thank you very much. Guys, I would let you know that in 2 weeks, November 3rd, we are having Adam, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name yet, Adam Oshorn from Curated Properties. That should be very, very interesting as well, knowing their project. Mazyar, thank you very much for your time and advice or lessons learned. That was actually in my opinion, one of the best webinars, probably because you're also familiar with How I Build This, the original podcast. So you really were able to share with us the challenges and low points in your career. So that is very, very valuable. It was for me, like I was thinking about it like for 6 months, not knowing what's going to be. Well, we never know what happens tomorrow, but you get the idea. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, guys, see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank
See
you.
you soon. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.